All right, Jake.
All right.
We're back. This is episode 2 of Off the Main Thread.
Yes.
Which will surprise people because it's been a month
rather than a year or two. Yeah, this is we're back on track. It's like the old times, like during lockdown, where we literally had nothing better to do than this.
Yeah. Let's see how quickly we can disappoint people again.
Did you think that's what we did last time? We were quite rusty. We should tell people that the previous podcast people heard was the second recording because the first one was just too rubbish.
Yeah, a bit boring. Just a bit out of practice. And still, I think the last podcast, well, it was actually, I have to say, it was really, really lovely seeing both the excitement leading up to the release and then the positive response after release to our very first new episode. That really was quite energizing, which is probably partly the reason why we were like, yeah, let's just lock in the next date immediately, record one. But yeah, like listening back to it, still a bit rusty, still
a lot of rust.
Bit of synergy.
Yeah. But in this episode, I want to talk about build tools and whether they're a symptom of a problem or whether they're part of a solution. And what are you going to talk about later on the show, Sam?
Well, I'm going to talk about build tools.
Oh, it's a very build tool heavy episode. That's exciting.
It is.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm gonna go a bit into a build tool that isn't popular on the web, I'd say, which in general probably isn't. It feels a bit niche. I'm going to talk about Bazel, the thing that Google open sourced.
Excellent. Oh, okay, that's exciting. And we should say, well, I am going to say that this podcast is sponsored by Shopify, in by which they let us do this and pay for the hosting and editing. And it feels like I have to say that. They're not asking me to say that, but I'm just so happy that they're paying for it.
No, but it's nice to acknowledge that, they said, you go do your podcast while you work for us as well. So that's nice.
So I'm in a new location because I have moved house since we last spoke.
Indeed. I have ever told you that I find the phrase moving house very weird as an ESL because you're not moving the house.
Oh.
You move the contents.
That is true. Huh.
I mean, unless you actually did move your house, which would be deeply impressive.
Oh God, no. Like, it was complicated enough what we did. And our intention was to be in a different building at the end. So, yeah. The buildings remained where they were, thankfully, throughout the process. But the process of, I know it's like such a privileged whinge, but the amount of people you just sort of hemorrhage money to that I don't understand what they do. I got an email from our solicitor, and it said this was all part of the agreeing the contracts, and this email said, I have taken a release from the buyer's solicitor and have given a release to your seller's solicitor. And maybe it's because I have the humour and wit of a 13-year-old boy, but that sounds like farts to me. Does it sound?
Yeah, strong release.
Yeah. And so I've just got this vision of the way that whole process of moving works is it's a load of solicitors in a room, cupping their hand, farting into it, and then kind of throwing it at each other in a very theatrical kind of Harry Potter wand battle kind of way, but throwing.
I imagine
farts.
it a bit to be like the touching cloth in terms of atmosphere, the touching cloth sketch.
Oh, we'll put a link to the touching cloth sketch because it is an absolute. It's one of my favorite sketches and features.
Especially because it's Olivia Colman.
Yeah, award-winning Olivia Colman talking about poo. I must have told you this before, but to one of the directors at Google, I was talking to him about a thing I'm working on, and I was like, I'll just send you a link to it. And I pasted the link, but it wasn't the link I intended. It was just whatever else was on my clipboard at the time, and it was that sketch. And when that happened, I was like, well, that's embarrassing, but you know what? Could have been worse. Could have been much worse.
Oh, yeah. There's stuff you've sent me that I think would have been probably many HR violations.
Yeah.
So.
Although it was to Parisa, who is head of Chrome News. I can't remember her title, but she is a good person and definitely saw the funny side of it.
She has a sense of humor
Absolutely.
while also being extremely important TM.
Yes, important and competent, and a sense of humor. What a mix! What a mix! Anyway, what have you been up to recently?
What have I been up to? Oh, I flew to Austria with my partner because they were giving a talk there, and I was just, along for the ride. And what really stayed with me for some reason, how sometimes you witness an interaction and you just keep thinking about it. And this seems like really mundane, but for some reason, I watched two passengers on the airplane squeeze past each other, kind of like the typical British, like, oh, apologies, thank you, oh, thank you, I'm so sorry. And then saying,
Yep.
enjoy your flight to each other. And I keep dissecting this 3-word sentence, enjoy your flight, when they're both
no
on
one
the
enjoys
same
flights.
plane. And we all know it's not going to be like that enjoyable. But what a weird thing to say, I thought.
It's true, yeah. Well, I mean, if one of them's in first class and one of them is in economy, then there might be relatively different.
I mean, you know how,
as you say, it's not going to be
inter-Europe flights, the business class is the same seats, but the middle seat has a table duct taped to it.
Yes, that is true. I got upgraded to one of those once, and it was a massive disappointment.
It's the same.
Although I was sat next to, not next to, because obviously the table is blocked out. Michael Portillo, who is a politician who now, instead of doing politics, does documentaries about trains. And my friend, who I was originally going to be sat next to, who was now a few rows back, is massively into his trains, and so there was a huge point of jealousy because I didn't bother Mr. Portillo about anything, least of all trains.
You're not massively into
my
trains.
friend's absolutely furious. Do you know what? I have spent years as a commuter, which has really soured trains for me. Like, they are just horrible means to ends.
Yeah,
much like planes.
In a way, yes. Although I've recently learned about the Emirates cabin class, which is higher than first class, where you have a whole cabin, like a closable little cubicle with a door.
Ooh.
And yeah, I don't know. I didn't look up how much it costs, but I was like, that is, looks nice. It's probably also going to be inaffordable to anyone.
Oh, absolutely. And I still maybe that will be different, but my theory on air travel is that it's no matter what class you look or pay your way into, it's still worse than, like, or you'd hope it's worse than your destination, right? Like, it's still, it's like, oh, this I'm in a seat that, for 10 hours that costs thousands of pounds or does at normal price, and it's just not as nice as my sofa at home or as nice as my desk chair. It's a feeling of relative luxury, but not actual luxury.
Yeah, it's kind of like you're just offsetting yourself from the worst case within this flying metal tube.
Oh, absolutely. No, when I'm paying for flights myself, my attitude is I don't know. If I could pay less and just be strapped to the wing of the plane, I would, because I will. It just feels like such a waste of money compared to like spending the same amount at the destination.
I agree.
On a nice meal or something.
Fully agree.
Should we talk about the web?
Let's talk about the web.
I genuinely didn't know that you were going to talk about, and I knew you were going to talk about Bazel at some point. I didn't know you were doing that in this episode, but that's kind of great because it makes it the big Build Tools Bonanza.
There's our title,
which I feel we might have. Have we done that before in another podcast? Anyway, let's assume we're not retreading entirely old ground. But yeah, I kind of wanted to talk about where Build Tools sits in the way we build websites and whether they're a good thing or not. And if we come to the conclusion no, then it's going to make your section very redundant. But here's the thing, we're not. So a bit of a spoiler alert there. When I first used the web, I was on a 14K modem, which was a little old even for the time. But just browsing around the web, like, the whole communication aspect of it, I found absolutely amazing. And I was looking at sites like, I don't know, Lisa's photos of disused underground stations, or like Terry's ring pull museum, like these proper sort of niche weird sites. But what struck me is, like, until this moment, I was used to getting information from large publishing houses or like broadcasting corporations, but like that's not what Terry and Lisa were part of. They weren't backed by these companies, so how were they doing it? And I found a little menu item in the browser I was using at the time, which I think was probably Netscape, and it was view source.
Dun dun dun.
I know, and but it blew my mind because I was now
For sure.
I I'd been using computers a long time before this, like playing games and stuff, and I'd always wondered how they worked. But you can't, when you're playing a game, you can't just right click and go to view source. But here I was looking at how the site was put together, and I could start to map bits of the code I was seeing to the bits of the site I was seeing, and I was like, it was how I got into web development.
My origin story isn't on the web, but I had a similar driving force, because for me, what I wanted to find out is, how do you make .exe files? Because it was a mystery to me. I looked at them on my computer, I drag and drop them into Notepad, and that was gibberish. And I sometimes found individual like sentences in there or words, and I tried changing them, and then everything broke.
Yeah, I've done that too.
Because I didn't know it had to be the same length.
Yeah.
And that's what I literally remember asking, like, how do you make exe files? Which is such a funny question to ask. But yeah, in the web is then what I did actually took my very first steps, and it was like, I write it in an editor and you open it in the browser and it does a thing. That's kind of amazing.
And you make a great point, because I had done the same exe thing, but then I did it with a web page. I saved did save as, and I had a HTML file on disk, and I went in and changed it, thinking because of the whole exe file thing, it's like, well, this isn't going to work. And then I dragged it into a browser, and I was like, what? Like, I have successfully modified this website. But I saw a talk recently that did like the same view source thing with a modern website, and the code was illegible. Like,
yes,
particularly like there was big class name lists like that were illegible, like a couple of characters each, like lots of different class names in the HTML. It was probably Tailwind but minified. And the question that was being put is like, the web has sort of lost its way, and have we lost something from those early days where we both played around with view source?
Oh, I have so many opinions and feelings, but I guess you also have some.
I do. Do you want to know them?
Yes, tell me, Jake.
Right. Okay. So I would consider myself part of the old school web crowd. Like, there's been people who have been around a lot longer than I have. But I feel like I share more of their ideals than perhaps some of the folks who started on the web at the same time as I did. A few years into my career, probably 5, 6, 7 years into my career, like the front end framework started becoming a big thing, and
What year are we talking?
Oh yeah. I was worried you might ask that. So I'm talking like Angular.
Yeah, I was going to say, it strikes me as like I would have, like, hearing that statement, I would have said, 2010, 2012.
Yeah, between 2010 and 2013, based on a blog post I wrote around the time. That's the only hook I've got. But, I was against these sites because they were serving like an empty body tag and then doing everything else with JavaScript. And that resulted in a much slower and worse user experience than the patterns I was using already. I felt like these things came with a steep learning curve, in my opinion, and a lack of escape hatches. I think we talked about this before.
I remember trying Angular 1, like at that time, or having to, because one of the companies I was working for used it, and it did not click for me. I liked the idea because I think Angular was one of the first ones where you had implemented your own HTML tags, almost,
yes,
like visually in terms of the syntax. But then you had, like directives and services, and like I was probably just not understanding the pattern, but it did not click when I should be using what, and I did not enjoy it.
Yeah, I couldn't get up the learning curve either. And even when I had something working, I would think, if I just do it this slightly different way, I can make it twice as fast. But the framework was like, no, this is not your project now, it's my project, and you may not do those things because I don't know those things yet. And that just sucked. I hated that as a pattern. Like there were benefits in terms of the DX, but I didn't feel they outweighed the cons, even in terms of DX. And so yeah, this is how I kind of have the date in my head, because I wrote articles about these issues like 10 years ago, so back in 2013, about like here's the benefits of progressive enhancement, and these frameworks throw it away, and it's not good. And like one camp, the old school web people, were very supportive of these articles, but like everyone who I was trying to reach out to at the time, the framework folks, were just like plain just dismissive, saying it was old-fashioned thinking, or that the patterns that I was talking about were not for, well, they were for websites, not web apps,
And that distinction still lingers around today, right? Like, I mean, even I sometimes make a distinction where the web in itself has started to be a lot more accommodating to what you would consider an app. But still the kind of like the document base type still bleeds through, and you have to work against it, especially at the start. Like in a native app, you think in display-sized views. And
yes,
you can build that on the web, but it's not the default. And I'm not saying it should be, but that's definitely one of those things where I'm always like, oh, I have to do this thing again, where if I want to think in apps, I have to build this kind of like view model in there somehow. And I guess it's both a benefit and a drawback of the web, and it is backwards compatible eternally.
Yeah, that definition of sites and apps is a really tricky one. Like, because I sort of get it, and I do refer to things, I will use the term website and web app, but there's no real definition of it, especially as like you can get the BBC News native app, but people will say that's definitely a website when you're looking at it in a browser. But then you've got things like, well, you use Wikipedia, but if you're editing an article, are you now is it an app now rather than a site? Like it's I do. There are vague feelings, whereas that feels like a site, that feels an app. But I think it's difficult to.
Just much more of a spectrum. I don't think there is a point even in defining a hard line, right? Like what do we gain from having a very specific line between you are a site and the other ones are an app? What decisions do you derive off of that? For me, it's much more about, offline caching. Both benefit, although probably traditionally more associated with being an app.
I think that's reasonable. But as years went by, I think newer frameworks had better escape hatches. I think React actually does a really good job of this right now, although I worry they're going to make it harder in future. But they had ways of generating markup as well, so you could serve HTML from a server or from a static build or something like that. Although I think it took a number of years from that point before we had tools that were making good use of it, and we see that now with like Remix, with Next.js, that kind of thing. And so this is modern day now, and some of the people who were dismissive about things like progressive enhancements like 10 years ago are now championing it, even building tools around it, even promoting courses around it. And I'm mostly happy about it, Surma. It's fine.
Yeah, there's no bitterness in your voice at all.
No, not at all. But it is a good thing. I wish it didn't take us 10 years to get there, but whatever. But okay, we still use build tools, like more so than ever. Like, whereas back when I started on the web, you'd write the code, send that code to the browser, and it would render on the page.
Oh, I'm biting my tongue so hard right now. Like it's such a trigger to make me go on an opinion rant. Please continue, Jake.
Are build tools a symptom of a problem that we should be solving, or should we be leaning into them more? And like I said at the start, because whatever. Like my take is that build tools are part of the solution, not part of the problem. And but I do feel this is where I start to split a little bit from the more old school web crowd that I have kind of considered peers and friends. I still do, but like I've kind of shared their thinking on a lot of stuff. But this is an area where I really don't. And I think the old school folks really dislike the upfront complexity of frameworks and build tools. But like, I see the point, but things like Terry's Ring Pull Museum, that you can still build that in the same way it was built back then. It still runs today. You can still build in that simple way. It's not that simple things have got harder, it's that the harder things have become possible, but you need tooling and like other like newer patterns in order to make that happen. Yeah, I hated earlier frameworks because they took a mallet to the user experience over what I saw as a fairly modest net gain in developer experience. But that changed, and now these newer frameworks and newer tooling, they close that gap. And I think it's possible now to use a framework and get out the other side better user experience and a better developer experience than you would without those tools. And I do think that is mostly down to the build tool.
For sure. There's always this thing of like make better developer experience so you free up developers to create better user experiences. And I think generally, I don't think that is universally true. If anything, you free up the developer to spend time on other things. I don't know, it's a cynical take, but every language, at least when it comes to compiled languages, has a build step. And that is there because programs are a lot better at squeezing performance and doing optimizations and being smart about the code base as a whole in one go than humans are. Like, I mean, the simple example is nobody wants to write minified JavaScript. Nobody wants to read code where variables have one letter and figure out what the code does. You want to write readable code so that other humans can work with that readable code. But you do want to ship minified code to your web server because less bytes over the wire equals good.
Yeah, and you're right. Like decades before the web, we had languages that had these build steps, and it meant that what you wrote was different to what the machine ran because what the machine ran was illegible. Whereas on the web in the olden days, like you would have to pick a target audience for the code. Like, is it the developers working on the code base or the browser that loads and interprets the code? And so these frameworks that I hated were leaning towards the DX side and making compromises on the UX. But in my own projects, like it wasn't perfect. Like I was making DX compromises in order to make it fast and smooth. But like you say, build tools mean you don't have to make that trade-off.
No, exactly. I think there was a phase where build tools, or even, I guess like frameworks, would do things to enable better experiences that turned into worse user experience, both in terms of performance, in terms of accessibility, in terms of bundle size. But that is all kind of like caught up a little. And I don't know if this is right to credit TypeScript, but I do think TypeScript to an extent has just made having a build step much more normal. And once you have that anyway, it becomes a lot easier to add other tools to it as well that do some of the other optimizations, minifying your HTML, processing your CSS, and just having a bundler set up in general. I think we started exploring what other work that is usually deferred to runtime can we push into compile time so that the site is smaller or faster and things like that. And I guess the extreme versions of this is stuff like Svelte, where they have almost like a pseudo language, which is still JavaScript with slight additions, but just much more stuff being done on the developer's machine at build time so that it doesn't have to be running on the user's machine or phone when they load the page.
Exactly. And another example of this is Bazel folks. They were showing off their code, which appeared to have an SQL statement in part of the front end code, and they were baiting people when they did this. They knew what they were doing, but a lot of people got very angry about separation of concerns. But I think a lot of developers are too quick to draw that line down. Things like languages, like we've got CSS, we've got HTML, there's a separation of concern. JavaScript, there's an extra separation of concern. Front end, back end, there's a separation of concern. And I think that's too simplistic a view of that. I think it's similar to that. Yeah, front end and back end, it's not the right separation of concern. Component models are a better separation of concern, I think, but also a separation of authored code versus served code is a valid separation, and that's one that build tools let us make. And that's why I think you didn't agree either. I didn't agree with this talk that showed like the ugly source code of some website, and it was like, oh, this is horrible and bad. Because like once the code hits the browser, all I care about is, does that work well for users?
Yeah, and I guess there is like a sentiment that I understand in that it was really nice back in the days to be inspecting other people's markup and website and learn from it. But I don't think that that is worth enforcing or like worth keeping at the cost of the users. In the end, like some pages are open source and you can learn from that. And by using build tools, we haven't prohibited the learning experience that we had, the learning approach where you start writing just an HTML file in Notepad and drag and drop it into the browser. That still works. You can still do that. And I think that's the more important part, that there is not a binary format that you have to put into browsers, right? Like you want to be able to continue just writing stuff, have no build tool, and get started understanding the fundamentals, the primitive languages, how they interact with each other. But a build tool is just doing optimizations that otherwise would not happen because they're too hard to do for a human by hand.
Agreed.
And then the users would suffer. Well, they suffer. That sounds pretty harsh, right? But, they could have had a much better experience. There's things that you would get for free.
Yeah. And although in some ways view source is dead, like long live DevTools, because they'll give you a tree of elements. It doesn't matter if all the white space is missing in the actual text. You'll show you the cascade of styles. It'll prettify minified code to some extent, or the source maps, that kind of thing. So yeah, although view source might look ugly, I think we've got tooling there now, which is much, much better at doing that job.
I mean, if people care about, keeping view source alive for their production websites, deploy your source maps.
Absolutely. And yeah, so we can use build tools to let us write beautiful, maintainable, readable code, source maps so people can inspect it as well. And we don't have to compromise on performance and usability or that kind of user experience stuff once it hits the browser. That isn't to say that all build tools and build setups are good. We've talked about it on the show before. I really struggle with Webpack. I could never understand Webpack configs, and I could never get my head around Webpack plugins. It has been years since I tried. It might be better. The docs might be better. The actual implementation might be better. But I have had a much better experience with Rollup, and I still consider it a superpower to go and read that. The Rollup docs are not long. You could just spend a couple of hours and read the lot, and then you know how to write plugins, and it is like a superpower, the things you can do with that sort of stuff.
We gave a whole talk on this, which we should probably link to. For me personally, like Vite has kind of replaced Rollup as my standard starting point. On the one hand, because the plugin interface is the same.
Yes.
So the superpower mostly remains intact. I say mostly because there is some minor differences. Like, for example, in Vite, while the development server is running, you cannot emit additional files, because it doesn't actually run Rollup. It runs ESBuild and its own implementation. In an actual build, it runs actual Rollup. So there it would fully work. It's in general, I think something that you always point out, having a different setup between development and production is always a bit of a concern. But so far, Vite has done it right. And I mostly use Vite because it does the one thing out of the box that I found quite hard to teach to Rollup, which is take an HTML file as my entry point, not a JavaScript file, where it actually figures out which CSS files are pulled in, which JavaScript files are pulled in, and does all the right things. It has support for CSS modules, JavaScript, TypeScript, JSX, all of that is just set up by default with good default configuration, but also always with the escape hatches to change the configuration or write your own plugins. And so for the vast majority of little things that I end up writing, Vite has been absolutely brilliant.
I've played a little bit with it, and every time I start a new project, I'm like, this is the one where I should, lean heavily into Vite. But I'm so wanting to get to the rest of the project that I don't, and I just use some
that's completely
roll-up setup that I've already. But I need to find the excuse to use it. So okay, build tools are good, but I also don't think we should stop advancing the platform because particular things are covered by build tools. And I really hope we can get to a point where bundling is less necessary. So, because right now we bundle into just a few JavaScript files, meaning if you make a small code change, you're invalidating the cache of a big chunk of code. We had this whole promise of HTTP 2 was going to solve this, right? But it didn't really pan out. But even in that world, even
because if you don't bundle the files, like if they're separate files, to get the similar loading behavior to bundled files, you would have to utilize H2 push. Because when the first file gets requested, you don't want to wait for the browser to discover what are the other dependencies. The server would like to go, and here's all the other stuff as well. But push turned out to be so hard to get right.
Yes.
That I think it's basically been deprecated. Like, it's not recommended by anyone at this point, as far as
I'm pretty sure browsers pulled it out of their implementations as well. But yeah, it'd still be nice to get that back in some way that actually works. But even if it did, I would still want a build step. I still want minification. I still want tree shaking. I still want hashing, right? Like, they're still important things that you don't just get by authoring files and throwing them onto an FTP server or whatever. But one feature that I do think is going to make a big difference is import attributes, which have recently landed in Safari and recently gained some TypeScript support. And we have talked about this before on a video episode of HTTP 203. Do you remember the episode, Surma?
I think we have. Wasn't it type assertions?
Yeah, it was. Well, do you know what? I don't even think it was back then. I don't think it'd even become type assertions. We were talking about the reason some feature like that was needed because of the bugs in importing JSON. And this was back in 2020, so 3 years ago. Just to catch folks up who haven't seen the episode, which I imagine is most people, a spec landed saying that you could import JSON now. Go have fun. So it'd just be like import data from like foo.json. There you go. Landed in the spec until someone pointed out, this is really bad because the person who decides if that's JSON or not is the server. Because it's not done by file extension, it's done by the MIME type, the content type that's sent as a HTTP header. So you could import JSON, which is super safe, like really safe to import, because it doesn't execute arbitrary code. You're only just going to get an object back. But later, someone, the owner of that site can just change it and start executing JavaScript on your site. So people decided that's a bad idea. The thing that should control whether it wants JSON or not should be the page, like the script, the thing that is the place it is going to be executed or parsed. So as you say, we got a feature called import assertions, which was import data from foo.json with assert JSON. So you're saying, like, go and import this, but only if it's in a JSON format. And that was a decision that was made, therefore, both by you as the importer, but also by the site. It still had to use the correct content type. And it shipped in Chrome ages ago. And it was in stage 3 in TC39. But they changed the syntax from, it stopped being import assertions and became import attributes. So it's import data from foo.json with type JSON. And I think it was just that rename was the difference. Because it still requires the correct MIME type to be coming from the server. So it's...
And is there a list of like supported MIME types? Because where's defined what that variable that I'm importing from that module, what it contains?
Well, it's down to the host by which a host is the browser. And so the HTML spec defines JSON and CSS as words that can be used. And Safari has shipped this. They shipped it for JSON, not CSS yet. But that works today in Safari. It works with the old syntax in Chrome. But yes, like you could have things like node or dno or button, like defining their own. It's potentially a place where you could end up with sort of namespace collision issues, but hopefully people are just sensible and work with standards groups, because that's how it always works.
That's quite interesting for bundlers, because I know that when in our projects we have always prefixed our import paths with a magic word and a colon, for example, both to signify to readers that this is special, this is magic, this will be processed by a build tool because it's clearly a non-standard path. But also that then when we write the plugin, we could just check for the prefix to know, should this plugin handle that? That's actually quite nice to potentially detach those two concerns, like separations of concerns, Jake.
I know, and that's exactly the thing I'm excited about. So we in our projects have used like fake URL schemes to signify that this import is doing something special. I kind of like that pattern. The pattern that typically happens is that a file is .css, so therefore the build tool is going to come and do something special with it. And like, I hate that pattern because you look at it and it just looks like a normal JavaScript import, except it's a CSS file or an image or whatever else. Because I'm left with like, well, what does it get out the other side? Like, what does it mean to import CSS? Does it get a style sheet object back? Does it get a string? Does it get a CSS module kind of thing? Like, if I import an image, am I getting an image bitmap, an object, a URL, base64 URL, a uint8 array? Like, and the way you find it out is by going and looking through the Webpack config or whatever, because this thing is defined with regex, so it's not even easy to find. You've got to crawl through and find it. And I actually think that pattern recreates some of the bug with JSON imports, like, because the script is requesting it, but the script doesn't decide what it gets back out of the other side. It's not the server in this case, but the build tool that chucks it out. It's not a security problem because the build tool and the source are hopefully kind of trust each other. They have to, really.
I mean, they're in a privileged role to begin with.
Exactly. But it's the same DX issue. Like, you just kind of like, you don't really know what's going to be spat out the other side. And as you know, there's another pattern which I hate even more in build tools, and that's ones that look at the AST and go, oh, this looks like new worker, and then a string. So I'm going to take that string and I'm going to assume it's a module. I'm going to import it as a JavaScript entry point that can be used as a worker, because every time I use a plugin like that, or a project that uses a plugin like that, I will modify the code in a totally legitimate way to do something I need to do, and I just pop off the rails of what that plugin understands as a worker. And I'm like, and okay, but as you say, like, these import attributes give us a standard way of dealing with this. Now I can say, like, import URL from cat.avif with type rollup URL, or like rollup image URL with sizes. Like, if I wanted it to give me a URL for the image, but also the width and height of the image as numbers that I can do stuff with, or import JavaScript as a worker, like, and give me the URL to that I can put in new worker or a service worker or a worklet, all of that kind of stuff.
I really like the idea, the future where bundler plugins, unless really otherwise necessary, just are listed as a mapping for which import types are they responsible for. And you know exactly that they basically wouldn't be allowed to transform the AST of other files except the ones that are imported with their specific identifier in the import statement. And so that would make it very easy to find in your bundlers config. You see a roll-up image URL with sizes identifier, and you go to the list of plugins and you see a mapping from roll-up image URL with sizes to a specific JavaScript function. You can then switch it out or look how it works. And it makes it so nice and clean to look at. I really like that idea.
That's the future I want. Unfortunately, we're not quite there yet. And the reason is, like I said, that TypeScript has support for this, and it does. But what it doesn't have support for is changing what's returned based on the type, which sucks.
That surprises me. But I mean, should I say, oh, that seems like an easy fix?
Well, look, they know it's a missing feature, and that there are discussions on it, and like how, because right now you end up with like one like d.ts file maps to one file. But now you're going to have a system where like one d.ts file is going to map to one file and the different types it can be imported as. But, they just need to go and solve that problem, and then everything's good.
I mean, it's already a bit like, like when we use our previous approach with, like a special marker string at the start of the import path, we had to solve this problem with what TypeScript gave us, which is you just declare module, like you use a, missing types DTS ambient module.
Yes.
And you do declare module and do identifier : star. This also works with other types. Often you will find this in other projects where they have star.css to define what will be returned when you import a CSS file in JavaScript. TypeScript can already do that.
Yes.
I guess they will have to maybe potentially add new syntax for declare module, potentially. But
well, I want them to go a step further than that. Like, I want them to do that because, yes, for things like import an image as URL with sizes, it's like, right, okay, whenever that's used, it's going to give you a URL and width and height numbers. But I would like to get to a point where that can be done on a per file level. So, like if you've got a CSS file that's imported as CSS module, that it doesn't have to talk about it in general terms. It could say like this specific file exports these properties when it's loaded as type CSS module or whatever. Like whereas right now you can just say it's like, oh, it's an object with string keys and string values, So being able to do it in individual d.ts files, I think would be really valuable as well.
Yeah, I agree. Well, can we link to a GitHub issue so people can comment?
Absolutely. I can go and find that again. But yeah, I think we're on a good path. I do think the web has changed in fundamental ways. I recently posted a silly 3D view transition. Just like a silly little demo, and more than one person replied saying, "Can I get the code for this?" And I was a bit like, "My friends, you have the code for this because you have the link to it." It was not minified. It was really simple. But I guess we have reached a stage now where people assume that the source of a website is not going to be useful to them in any way, and they need the unbundled, unbuilt, tooled version. But I think where we are is much better than where we were, and so I say that let's keep on build tooling.
Yeah. So on that note, Jason Langsdorff, formerly Netlify, now does a really good YouTube channel called Learn with Jason. Has started a new series called 4 Web Devs, 1 App Idea, where he has 4 web developers and all get the same concept given, and they build it and then send it to each other and compare and critique. And I haven't fully watched the video, but Cassidy Williams is the first one in this video, and she built an app with no build tools. She just handwrote HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, and I was like, you go. That's really cool to see. Also, it was really funny to see both the comments and reactions on Twitter where people were really surprised that that's possible. And it made me realize that it has become, I guess, a niche approach. I do this all the time where I just, grab I give HTML elements an ID and grab them all off of document.all, just like quickly string things together.
Yeah.
But obviously most starter kits, most people who start web development start a couple layers higher with a framework and a build tool in the middle. So hats off to Cassidy for showing off that is very much a valid and completely capable approach to writing a web app.
Oh, absolutely. And like I say, you're considering, when the code hits the browser, you're considering the user experience the most. But if your users are developers who are using that source to learn how to do stuff, then yeah, that's a great reason. And that's what I did with the view transition demos. And that's why I didn't minify them, because, it's a developer audience. I want them to view source and I want them to have a good experience doing so.
Yeah. Well, do you want to hear how I have probably offended the royal family?
Do you know what? Yes, I do.
And I'm not sure we can leave this in, but I'm gonna tell the story anyway, and we'll see.
Okay.
We drove to London.
Yep.
For a friend's birthday. Dropped my partner off, and I dropped them off at Green Park.
Yeah, very close to the
very
Royals.
Close to, yeah, Buckingham Palace.
Buck Powell.
I had my dog in the back of the car. I had lots of other stuff in the car. And anyone who knows London knows parking in that area is virtually impossible.
I'm amazed you took a car there. Like, that's,
Well,
you tend to only make that mistake once.
Well, no, it was just to drop my partner off. I was then continuing it on and was going to meet them somewhere else. But we were short for time. That was the way to make sure they would make their appointment in time. So it was, however, because we were late, we did a non-stop drive from Bristol early in the morning.
Yeesh.
And I had to wee.
Yep. And there are famously, do you know what? Toilets at Green Park Station.
Yeah, but I'm in a car. And I have a dog in the car. Okay. And there's nowhere to park.
No.
And I can't really leave my dog alone in the car, even if I had found a place to park. So I was like driving around trying to find like a spot or even just like an alley where, I could maybe put the hazards on and jump into a cafe or something.
Sure.
And and after driving around pretty much aimlessly, because this was getting very urgent, just like trying to, because I was even closer to Buckingham Palace. And I did what any brave trucker would do.
I'm looking forward to this. Go on.
I peed in a bottle.
Yep.
In my car, right next to Buckingham Palace.
Way. And then you threw it into the big fountain while shouting, "God save the Queen."
Maybe I should have done that. But that was the first in my life in general. I was like, I did see that, and there was a CCTV camera, and now I'm wondering if anybody has this tape. But I don't know. I feel like is this a rite of passage as a British citizen?
What, to have a Buck Powell pee-pee?
Yeah.
I've not done it myself. Because I have gone at the station though, so I guess that counts as my Buck Powell pee-pee.
Yeah, well that count because it's obviously a thing now.
Well, that's your joining pack is in the post. You can now be I think racist towards people coming to the country. I think that's what happens. Like you get your rite of passage, and now you have to be like, close the door behind you.
I have been
become
looking
one of those
for
people.
that privilege for many, many times. Should we rather talk about, well, I was going to say the web, but actually this is not web, at least not super web. Do you want to hear about Bazel? Do you want to learn a little bit?
I've been looking forward to you talking about this topic for a long time. So yes, I am ready.
You've been staying away from a work meeting where I talked about Bazel, so you can actually not know what is coming.
I know.
It's been a really interesting journey. So I guess I should really make sure that people know what I'm talking about, because it is not a mainstream build tool, I'd say. It is very much in use only at big companies with big products. So like Snapchat uses it, Uber uses it, Stripe, like all like fairly big names. And sure, there's also smaller companies, but when you look around, you don't hear about it a lot naturally, especially in web development, because it was built for more projects where compiling is part of the process. So Java, C++, now Rust, and similar things.
Is that right? Its origins were in like more of a typical like C++ tool chain. Is that where it comes from?
I think it was built at Google, or like its predecessor is built at Google and still in use at Google, called Blaze. And I don't know exactly where the differences between Blaze and Bazel are, but they're conceptually and I think even syntactically mostly the same. And yeah, like, so it was built to do the things that Google needs to do: build huge Java code bases, build huge C++ code bases, later on build huge Go code bases. So it has all of those things out of the box, and very much you can smell that it was made by Google, but you can extend it, and it has been extended, which is where it actually becomes usable and interesting for large web code bases. And so that's the angle I want to talk about a little bit, like, because that's what this podcast is about web stuff. But I think it's important to note that Bazel is not like Vite or not like Turbo Repo, what Vercel has published, which is also like big monorepos, because those are all JavaScript specific. Bazel is more like Make in that it's a build tool orchestrator. So Bazel itself doesn't do building, it orchestrates other tools that do the building.
Okay.
And in that sense, like Make, it invokes other tools and takes their output and does that multiple times recursively until the thing you want to have out the other end comes out the other end. But yeah, so I'm going to talk about it in the context of web apps because we now have lots of build steps in normal production web apps, which starts with, you just have to take your TypeScript code and transform it into JavaScript code, remove the type annotations and stuff. But also, Sass or CSS modules, all of those things are build steps. Bundling is a build step and as such can be modeled in Bazel. The thing that a tool like Bazel brings to the table is skipping work when it doesn't need to be redone, which sounds very simple, but it's actually quite hard to get right.
Yeah, this is something that I've not seen many web bundlers do really well. It tends to be like something you'll have in Make, right, rather than...
Yeah. Well, I think we're kind of getting there. So for example, TypeScript, the TSC compiler, introduced incremental builds, which is that thing where it doesn't type check a file if it's already done it previously and it hasn't been changed. Vite now has a cache as well. And especially tools like even Webpack has a cache. Vite does as well, Rollup as well, but only while they're running in what is usually called watch mode. So they do everything, produce the output, and they watch your source tree. And if a file gets changed, they are smarter about what work needs to be redone. But if you kill the server and you restart it, usually it does everything all over again. Even there, I think Vite now is starting to get better. But wouldn't it be interesting if not every tool had to reinvent these mechanisms? Because it becomes a bottomless pit, because then the Sass toolchain needs its own cache, and then the bundling toolchain and the CSS model toolchain, each of those should start having their own cache. That seems like wasted effort. And so tools like Make take the approach like they have. It's a bit like actually old school Unix philosophy where write a tool that does one thing and one thing well. And Make's one thing is effectively knowing how to invoke build tools and knowing when it's not necessary. And I guess I should maybe explain how, like, without going into like how do you write a Make file, but Make does this by annotating every command in your build script, so to speak, with the input files that it needs and the output file that build step generates. And it then checks if any of the input files has a newer date, like a modification date, than the output file. And if that's the case, that means an input file has changed since it was last built. I need to rerun this build step. And that's pretty much all the magic behind Make. Of course, there is, there's environment variables and all, like, it is quite the complex system, but at a conceptual level, that's all Make is doing.
It's such a simple system, it starts to make me wonder why the web's build tools haven't done this, right? Like...
Well, with Make, even you do at some point encounter that you run into a couple of problems. For example, it doesn't really know when you upgrade your compiler. Like the tool that you invoke, it doesn't know whether that's been updated since the last build or not. It can't really check that easily. So if I, for example, were to update if I used a Make file and I were to update from Sass version 19 to Sass version 20, a Make file would not rebuild because it thinks the build is still completely out. The input files haven't changed, but the tool has changed.
Right.
When it comes to actual compilation,
the output would be different, but it doesn't know that it needs to make it happen.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things where Bazel goes a step further on this front. On the first thing, like it doesn't use dates. While it seems to work quite well for Make, it always feels a bit fragile to me. I don't trust the dates on my files on the file system. Like if you unpack an archive, you can
Yes.
put arbitrary dates on them. Bazel instead uses content
Hashes?
Yeah. So it's
There we
based
go.
on the content, and it says basically, well, if the hashes of the input files haven't changed, therefore the output file wouldn't change. Of course, it has to store that somewhere, and there is your local Bazel cache, but that's just a detail. But in this sentence is an interesting assumption, namely that if the input files haven't changed, the output will not change, which means that Bazel assumes and enforces that every one of your build steps is, I could say, pure. Like same inputs to the function must give the same output. If that isn't true, Bazel will not be able to cope with it.
Doesn't that just reintroduce the same problem with make then, like where you upgrade your version of Sass or TypeScript or whatever?
That's a very good question, Jake.
Thank you.
Basically, Bazel says your build steps need to be hermetic, because what they want to achieve is cacheability and reproducibility. They want to be able to roll back and rebuild the exact same version of your build, even from years ago. So everything in your build setup needs to be explicitly specified and hermetic. So in Bazel, not only are your files encapsulated in your build files effectively, but also the tool chains, and that is stuff like Node. So in Bazel, you specify which exact version of Node you want to use to do this build. In that sense, now the tooling, your compiler or whatever, is part of the cache key. So it all becomes, obviously the files are hashed, but not only are the files together used for the cache key, but also what is your processor architecture, which for JavaScript is technically not relevant, but for, compiled languages, it very much is. But also, which exact tool are you invoking? What is the version of the tool? Where do I get it from? Because Bazel also takes care of setting that up. So if I clone a fresh Bazel project and I say, build it, it downloads the tools. Even if I have Node installed on my system, it downloads the exact version to make sure the build remains hermetic and reproducible. And
so this is taking some of the kind of Docker containering kind of stuff, right? It's part of that theory.
Actually, and that parallel is a good point because it goes further. They also do these builds in a sandbox. This is not like a security sandbox. It is more a sandbox where each build step is executed in a sandbox where only the files and the tools that you have declared as inputs are there. So while your actual your GitHub repository has loads of files, if my build step is only about the CSS file and the tool that turns that CSS file into a CSS module, then while that script executes in the sandbox, only that one CSS file will be visible. It's as if the file system had nothing else but those files.
Nice.
And that way, Bazel helps you discover if you rely on more than what you have specified. So it really, in a way, it helps you be hermetic and make sure that what you have is reproducible. I should be clear that Bazel itself, out of the box, doesn't know how to do JavaScript and bundling or any of that. There is, of course, as I said, it invokes those other tools. But because they have to be hermetic and Bazel needs to know, where do I download this tool? There's an ecosystem mostly by the people from a company called Aspect, which have written rules for, JavaScript, which does Node, for TypeScript, which has a TypeScript compiler, ESBuild, Rollup, SWC, Jest. There's a good chunk of off-the-shelf, I'm going to call them plugins because it is kind of that, but in Bazel they're called rules. So it is, they take care of all the heavy lifting. What's really interesting is that they also take care of your dependencies. So they understand the package JSON, which is actually not correct. They don't look at the package JSON. They in fact ignore the package JSON. They require you to use the package lock JSON or the yarn lock.
Makes more sense because that's where the actual version numbers are, right? Rather than the hash, sort of vague ranges.
And the hash, so they verify as well to protect you from supply chain attacks, for example. They make sure that what you're putting is exactly what is expected. Again, reproducibility is one of the big things of Bazel. Right. So I won't be able to give a narrative tutorial on Bazel. I might actually see if I can write up a little example repository where people can look at what it looks like to work with Bazel instead. But what you do, like in, when you use make, you write a make file, which is effectively a series of command line invocations with those extra annotations of inputs and outputs. In Bazel, it's a bit more complex due to the nature of it, and you write it in a language called Starlark, which really is just Python. They just
really?
Yeah, it is really just Python. They just removed the abilities to have side effects. So from within Starlark itself, you cannot access the file system. You only can almost work declaratively. Again, this is for the reason that Bazel wants to be able to analyze what your build looks like before actually having to run it, and it helps it, yet again, to be hermetic, to be pure,
nice,
without side effects. Under the hood, all what you're writing in Starlark is usually, macros, which are invocations of more macros, which in the end boil down to rules, and rules just emit series of actions. So everything in Bazel boils down to actions, which are very simplistic, low-level activities like copy a file, run a command, take a file as output, and you just chain those together, arbitrarily complex. What is interesting, though, because they enforce this rule of having to specify the tool and the input file and the expected outputs explicitly every single time, Bazel gets implicitly for free this entire deep dependency graph. And when one single file changes, it can immediately tell you which actions need to be rerun. If a file didn't change, the copy doesn't need to be done. It's already done. But if a file did change, it knows exactly which path to the graph it basically has to take to get the refreshed output at the end. And that's how Bazel gets so good at rebuilding very fast, because it is able at a very, very granular level to skip work that doesn't need to be done. And I will say this one thing, with Bazel, the caching works. Not once in my entire journey so far did I have to wipe the local cache or any cache to fix a build. It was always I who was wrong. While with make, I definitely had the other experience where I typed in make, it said, oh no, your build is up to date. I deleted the cache, I ran make, and I got a completely different output file. Like, I think many people have encountered it, and I think with most build tools, we have encountered that. I remember with Parcel as well, which is a quite sophisticated tool chain and does a lot of caching, but there I had it a couple times where I had to wipe the cache to fix my build. And
even with the new TypeScript build stuff where it creates a directory of all of its cache stuff. Yeah, I've had similar things where like the types just aren't working, and I'm winding myself up trying to fix these red squiggly underlines, and then I just get rid of the cache folder, and it's good now. Yay.
So I should be clear, Bazel isn't perfect. There is definitely, you can make them not hermetic, and sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes it's just what it is, especially I think in C++ land, which I haven't done with Bazel. I have heard that there is just no way around the fact that you need to link again to operating system libraries that are on the system, on the machine. And that is, of course, technically not hermetic. I think, for example, on macOS, you need to link against one of the operating system libraries for the kernel to even allow you to run it. But to the most extent, they try to guarantee that these build tools are hermetic. So I guess we should finally talk about web and what it looks like building web stuff with Bazel. But if you take the rules for JavaScript, you could just invoke stuff from NPM. So I could just write a single rule and say run Vite, and that would work. But
you're not getting any of the granular benefit, right?
Exactly.
Like as soon as it wanders into rollup land, it's having to look at all the files and do all the stuff, and
exactly. You would throw away all the benefits that you might be getting. But let's think about what a default setup with Vite or our default setup with rollup would do. It turns all your TypeScript into JavaScript. It bundles all your JavaScript. It turns import statements that end in CSS into CSS modules, which under the hood is, on the one hand, mangling the class names and then outputting a JSON file that has a mapping from the original class name to the new CSS module class name, and of course all the special CSS module directives that exist. You have other stuff like you can import images to get a path to the production URL of the image, or even the sizes, as you mentioned earlier. You could even have stuff like, if you import an SVG, please run the SVG optimizer before you add it to my production build. All these things are possible. And most of these things end up being plugins in modern build systems. With Bazel at the start, it feels a bit awkward because of that sandboxing and the requirement to having to list every single file, it feels a bit awkward to just like have to write that all down. Of course, you can use globs and say like, oh, just my inputs are all JavaScript files, but it's definitely a bit different because it's even stuff like your node modules folder won't be there unless you specify it as an input. And now you can think about, do you want the whole modules folder or only parts of it, like specific packages? Because, for example, if you update your test dependency, like if you update jest, that doesn't affect your build. So really, ideally, you don't want to rebuild your project just because you updated your version of jest. You want your tests to rerun, but not the build. And by default, like the rules for JavaScript do the right thing. But it's quite interesting to discover that these things actually are optimization angles that you can benefit from. And on bigger projects, all these things can add up to a huge difference. In Bazel, I actually ended up doing it a bit different. So we are currently looking at Bazel at Shopify, and so I've been experimenting a lot with it. Instead of putting it all on one build tool and loading plugins, we have tried to move most of the work into either off-the-shelf CLI tools from NPM or otherwise, or little one-off node scripts. So for example, instead of leaving it up to the bundler to consume CSS and invoking a plugin on it, we have instead written a small script that invokes post-CSS with a CSS modules plugin. It takes a single CSS file as input and outputs a single CSS file and a JSON file with that mapping. And we run the scripts individually on each CSS file, which sounds incredibly slow. And technically it is, because every time you spin up Node, you load all the packages. Oh, actually, you create the sandbox with all the files. You spin up Node, you load the script, you load all the required packages. You read the file, you process it, and you do the output. But you only do that once. And then the new output files are now, together with your actual JavaScript code, given to your bundler of choice. In our case, it's ESBuild, but you could use rollup. Later, maybe we can use roll down when that becomes a thing. And what is really interesting to me about
Hang on, so just roll down is that the Rust?
Yes, that's the Rust
re-implementation of
that they're working on.
Nice.
Yeah, what's really interesting for me was the realization that we have decoupled our tools that do the pre-processing from our choice of bundler. Because if we wanted to migrate from, Vite or ESBuild to roll down, we would have to make sure that a plugin exists for CSS modules, but actually also that it's the same version of CSS modules behaves the same way, because otherwise maybe it's a corner case and now suddenly our app breaks. With this, the CSS module processing is a separate tool. And as far as the bundler is concerned, it's only consuming JavaScript, nothing else. And that's actually also a performance benefit, at least in our case, because ESBuild, being written in Go, does not invoke Node or a JavaScript engine unless absolutely necessary. So your plugins usually
stays in Go land.
Exactly. So it's parsing in Go, it's doing the bundling in Go. But if you have a plugin, you have to register it with a regex to say only files that match this regex should be handled by my plugin, and only then does ESBuild effectively shell out to Node, which is of course
slow,
full of overhead.
Yeah.
And so the one benefit is ESBuild gets to stay almost all the time in Goland and be fast. But also we have decoupled our quote-unquote plugins from our choice of bundler. And usually in ESBuild, but also Rollup and other tools, when you restart the tool, it would do all the CSS work and other plugin work all over again. With Bazel now providing a generic caching smartness engine almost, it just reuses the previous output. And so if you change your JavaScript code, only the bundler gets invoked, which is now very fast, none of the CSS stuff. And we've really seen some very interesting numbers where that gets lots of benefits in terms of, just build speed, which is exactly what we were after.
And I think there's the X benefits there as well. A lot of the tools that I've seen handling CSS modules, your importing it, and it does all of the handling of it at build time. But with that sort of pre-processing, essentially sort of it becoming a pre-process in the Bazel system, is you can actually be outputting the like the d.ts files or the raw JavaScript files that will have the module names in them. So when you're working with it in a code environment, you get autocomplete on the module names, rather than just saying it's an object where the keys are strings and the values are strings.
Yeah, there is a couple of things that are not as simple, which I'm going to get to in a bit, or that have slight drawbacks, of course, as well. But there is a huge angle for DX here as well, because Bazel takes care of downloading the tool chains and has all of it kind of codified. As I said, like getting started on a project that uses Bazel is as simple as just running that Bazel command. And Bazel is published to NPM. So basically, npm run dev can still work, and it just runs Bazel. So as far as the developer is concerned, they wouldn't even have to necessarily know that Bazel is being used. And because Bazel is agnostic, it actually gets really interesting if you, for example, are a WebAssembly user and you have multiple programming languages at work. So I've been actually thinking about for Squoosh, where we have parts of it on Rust, part of it on C++. For a time, we even had a bit of assembly script. Then the main app is TypeScript. Actually, also almost like 3 TypeScript projects for workers, for the service worker, and for the main app. Built with Rollup. In Bazel, it is very easy to express that an output of the Rust project should be an input for the web project, which currently is a bit shoehorned in. And the last thing, or the main thing where you can, well, at Shopify, we're trying to save time and money, but I think where even some open source projects could benefit from is that the caching, while it happens on your disk, can also be stored remotely. So Bazel, out of the box, is able to just put all these artifacts onto an S3 or a Google Cloud Storage bucket. And so if you make that bucket world readable, or you give credentials to everyone, Bazel will check whether a build step needs to run. It will first check your local cache, but then it will check that remote cache. And rather than actually building it, it will just download the output, which, for longer builds, bigger builds like Rust to WebAssembly, can be really beneficial. Or if you want to, reduce your minutes spent on GitHub Actions, because it will just download the artifact rather than building everything, because maybe your PR is just, a quick change to one CSS file, which means you don't want to rebuild all the WASM and all the bundling. There's a lot of things here where you can really squeeze build time and performance out of many things in your build pipeline by Bazel just like skipping work. And I really like that they just allow it to just put in an S3 bucket, and that is your remote cache now. And again, it still works. Bazel's caching factors in your operating system and architecture so that you don't rely on artifacts that don't work for you. I've been just really impressed with how reliable the caching is. But usually caching is one of the hard problems in computer science, isn't it?
Absolutely. It'd be interesting to see if this takes on in the web, because it feels like we went from pipeline-based build systems with Gulp in particular, and to these kind of more monolithic things like Webpack and Rollup. Be interesting to see if we do come back a little bit to one of these systems where it is sort of more a file pipeline based, but then the bundling at the end.
It is, and I really like that architecture as just like a mental model. But I guess I should then also talk about the things that I dislike about Bazel, because it is. I definitely don't think it should, in its current incarnation, it's not for everyone. It's not for every project. It's Bazel itself is written in Java, then runs this Python-like language and invokes all the other tools. It definitely has a steep learning curve, and the documentation is a bit meh. Like, it's there and it's good, but it's it definitely was a steep hill for me to climb. And the more I look how specifically the rules for JavaScript work under the hood, the more I feel a bit weird about it. It obviously works, and it works correctly, and I think they are the way they are for good reason. But one of the things that they use in the sandbox is that, to be faster, I suppose, they don't copy all the files and tools you need into the sandbox. They use symlinks. And for JavaScript, that can actually turn a bit into a problem. Because if you imagine you're processing a file as a bundler that is a symlink itself, and you have a relative import, like import a component from ... something, you are the bundler. What do? Do you resolve that import to where the symlink is or to where the actual file is? And what if there's multiple levels of symlinks? And this has caused many headaches for me to figure out how to do the right thing. Even Node itself, because it actually executes that line of JavaScript, you can tell Node via command line flags to not resolve symlinks or to resolve symlinks. And both versions have caused problems in different scenarios. So
I was going to say, resolving sounds like the right thing in the same way that, do you know what? I was going to say in the same way that on the web, redirects are followed. And now I'm losing confidence in that statement, but I am 70% sure that redirects are followed, and it's the final destination that is the module. I don't know anymore.
I mean, if you want to dive a little bit deeper for 1 minute. So as I said, you can specify that your input is the entire node modules folder or just sub-packages of it. So the node modules folder is a real folder, but everything inside is a symlink. Now, if you've written code without thinking about Bazel, a package could do something like import ... other package name, because that would work in production. But now, because if you know you're in node modules, you know ... other package name will give you the other package. Now in Bazel land, where you are actually somewhere completely different on disk, if you don't resolve the symlinks, then that still works. If you do, you're importing nothing or something different. And so sometimes there's just, if your code base is written for Bazel, that's fine. If it wasn't for Bazel and you're migrating to it, you will find lots of interesting things breaking because of the assumption that everything is actual files on the file system, and we just had lots of that. So that's definitely something. And when I look at how these rules for JavaScript are implemented, they mostly make that work by kind of injecting custom loaders into Node that deal with all of that. And I'm sure they did it right. I just don't like it because it's not Node anymore. It is Node with monkey patches. And again, I get it, but I usually don't want that. And it just feels a bit weird, to be honest. But yeah, I'm trying not to question it because the benefits just outweigh my desire for purity, I guess.
There's signs that it has not been built for the other tools that we use on the web right now. But, maybe that could change in future.
Yeah, maybe. And I think, I was kind of thinking, couldn't they add a flag where I say, for this build step, don't use symlinks, actually copy them, or use hard links, or I don't know, use a custom file system driver where you can actually layer multiple things. The other gripe I have, well, it's not really a gripe, it's just like something that has caused frustration, that in Bazel, the input file cannot be overwritten by an output file. So every file name globally in your build pipeline is pretty much unique, or at least can't be used at the same time. And that doesn't sound too bad, but I have had it where, for example, CSS modules, where I wanted the output CSS file to have the same name as the input CSS file, but Bazel would error me saying sorry, your input and output have the same name, and that doesn't work. So I had to do filename.process.css and then figure out how to rewrite the import to now point to processed or to point to the JSON. So that's just like minor nuisances, and you can totally deal with them. Overall, I find Bazel really interesting to think about, really interesting to work with, and I'm genuinely considering maybe not to merge it, but just to try it out if I can migrate Squoosh to it, because I want to see what it's like if people wouldn't have to worry about having Docker or anything installed and could contribute to both the codecs or just the web app with the same build tool. Mostly maybe as an experience report, and then potentially writing a blog post just to contribute to one more piece of documentation for Bazel out there. There's obviously a lot more I didn't talk about. For example, Bazel can model tests and applies the same smartness to tests. As far as Bazel is concerned, a test is just a build. So for example, the rules for Jest break your tests apart into all the files, and it will only rerun the suite from a single file if any of the inputs files have changed.
Oh, nice.
Which is really smart. So it really reruns the tests that have been affected by your code changes, which is really good for stuff like CI, where you potentially want to skip unnecessary work, unnecessary tests, and still get a valid, green check mark. So that's really interesting. It has, and I mentioned this only in passing, this really detailed dependency graph, and that is actually inspectable. You can write queries, almost like a SQL query. It's a different language, but you can write queries to figure out, is there some way where this package is imported by that package? And if so, how? Because, for example, a problem we've had is where the lazy loaded part of the app was accidentally statically imported by the initial part of the app. Bazel would help you write a rule that basically could fail CI when it finds a static import edge from the initial part to the lazy part, and could say, you did a bad, don't do that. You could just express that as a query. You could also visualize it as a graph. You can find if you have multiple versions of the same dependency from NPM in your app. All these things become quite easy to express. Bazel can do remote execution because it does this whole hermeticity thing where, everything that is needed, including the tool, is encapsulated declaratively. Technically, you can just throw that at a different machine and run the build there. So if you have a very build-heavy app, you can scale it out across a network, across multiple machines, and get a very easy build cluster. And lastly, this
is what happens with Chrome, right? Like, yes. This is when they're building browsers. That's a similar sort of pattern.
I guess lastly, there's iBazel, which is the file watcher for Bazel. Again, because it can inspect this dependency tree and knows every single file and where it is used. It is very good at knowing what steps to rerun when you make a change. And iBazel just does this automatically the second you save a file. And that integrates really nicely with then a dev server like Vite, which just picks up the output and serves it to your browser. That is my current state of Bazel. I probably should have said as a start, like, I'm still in my journey of learning. I'm still very much a beginner, so this should all be taken with a huge pinch of salt. But I had fun. I have fun thinking about it and using it. And I'm glad I was given a reason to learn it.
It sounds that the way of it reducing what is needed per build is, I mean, we've seen it in not just large apps, but sites as well. I know some of the static build stuff that we had with web.dev when that was a static build site.
Yes.
That suffered from this problem. It was rebuilding the world every time, and it was taking half an hour. So I think, systems like this, I think, become really valid and interesting as solutions there. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's got legs. I'm interested in it as well.
Well, I wanted to point out that we have managed to record more than last time.
Wow. I know. Amazing. We can hopefully get 10 minutes off this.
We said this 10 minutes, and then we are roughly at the same time as before.
Yeah, exactly.
We're not any further along on a new sign-off catchphrase, are we?
Oh, at some point I'm gonna suggest going back to the old one because I miss it.
That was good, wasn't it? Should we just do that? Because I enjoyed it too.
Yeah, it'll be like a lovely warm blanket to sign off on. Oh, take it away. Happy next time. Bye-bye.
Oh, you got to kidding me.
Off you go. Make sure Watson barks as well. I'm not hearing a lot of Watson. There we go. That's what I wanted to hear.
I'm back.
Well, we've got the end of the podcast sorted.
Yeah.
Maybe just every episode can be you going to the door and Watson barking. So
it's how we roll. HMRC. That's not... I'm going to open this live on podcast now.
Oh, someone's done a fraud.
A self-assessment statement. This is just, I did my job, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
I did my thing. All good. I've not pulled any criminal activities into my taxes.
Not that they've caught you for, anyway, so...
Exactly.